Welcome to Chats with Atheists once again. My name is Father Antonius from Sydney, Australia, and I'm joined once again today by Peter Bowditch. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
Acclaimed atheist and all-round nice fellow as well, may I say.
Oh, thank you.
Lovely to have you with us. Today we're going to be getting into a bit of a deep topic. The question of beginnings and how things came to be. And the deeper question really that we want to address today is, why does anything exist rather than nothing? I think the intuitive and first answer that a person thinks of when they think about the universe is, well, there must be some reason why the universe exists. If there was no reason, we could well imagine that nothing would exist. We can imagine that. We may not be able to picture it, but we can imagine a situation where nothing at all exists. I have a cross here. This one? Yeah? What's it doing?
Flaring off it.
Is it alright?
Do you want me to...
No, that's fine.
Was it there before?
Okay, that's fine. Okay.
Sorry, can we go from the top again?
So that means from the beginning, doesn't it?
We'll do, it's fine, we'll do from the beginning.
Okay.
And then, you guys ready with your cameras?
Okay.
And
Again.
5, 4.
Hello and welcome once again to Chats with Atheists. My name is Father Antonius from Sydney, Australia, and I'm joined once again, I'm pleased to have the wonderful company of Peter Bowditch, the wonderful atheist and all-round nice guy.
Thank you.
Today we're going to be getting into a rather deep topic. When we look at the universe around us, we can't help but ask, where does it come from? How did it begin? Why does it exist? The simple scenario that we can think of is that if there is no reason for anything to exist, then there should be nothing. So the deep question that we want to get around to today, Peter, is why is there something rather than nothing? Why do things exist rather than there be nothing? It's not a new question. It's a question that's been asked for thousands of years by humanity. There have been many different answers that have come up. The one, of course, that people like me, we Christians, believe in is that God is the cause of all that exists. But in recent times, some very intelligent people have been coming up with answers that don't involve God, trying to come up with, I suppose we could say, a scientific answer to this question. The most recent and most famous one is probably by Lawrence Krauss, a very respected scientist, who has come up with an explanation for how universes can pop out of the vacuum of space. How do you feel about these attempts in general first, before we turn to Lawrence Krauss's particular theory?
I think that it's a legitimate concern of science to ask these questions and try to find answers for them. One of the problems is the definition of nothing. The human mind can't comprehend some things. One of these things is infinity. That is, we assume that everything has a boundary around it. And so it's very difficult for the human mind to imagine that the universe goes on in all directions forever. In fact, we're actually, no matter where you are in the universe, you're at the centre of it, which is another sort of strange idea. That
it goes against our intuitions, doesn't it?
Yes. But even back from when people looked up at the stars and thought, there's a canopy there with lights in it, we assumed that that was the end of it. We didn't ask the question of what was outside that.
Yeah.
We have the same thing with what constitutes nothing. And what people like Krauss and that are saying is that before the Big Bang, before the initial thing that started the universe, there wasn't nothing in the sense that we think of it, or we try to think of it. That is, that there was nothing existing at all. There was something existing. And out of that, through statistical fluctuations or whatever, events happened which set in train the evolution and creation of the universe as we know it now. We can date that time. We know it's about 13.7 billion years ago.
I believe it's been upgraded to 13.85 recently.
Something like that, yeah. I went to a presentation by some young Earth creationists once and signed the visitor's book saying I've been waiting 13.7 billion years for this. It wasn't taken very nicely by them. I think that's the problem. We don't know what nothing is, but it's quite legitimate to look at the origins of what we see around us. The physicists are saying it can be done without God, it can be done with mathematical calculations, statistical calculations and so forth. But they still seem to me somewhat unconvincing. But then I'm not a physicist. I don't claim to be as smart as some of these people.
Yes, no, neither of us probably are. But
oh, that's right, most of us aren't.
Before we get into that, I'd just like to focus on this concept of nothing that you brought up. So as I understand what Krauss is saying, he's saying that even now, as we speak, perhaps somewhere in the universe, in the vacuum of space, there's a quantum fluctuation, whatever that may be, and out of that a new bubble universe starts to emerge and gradually pushes our universe aside and grows into something like our universe. And that 13.85 billion years ago, that's how our universe began in some other universe. Now that still leaves the question though of, well, where did the other universe come from? And where did the universe that spawned that one come from? Do you hold to the idea that there's an infinite series of universes, or do you think that there has to be a beginning somewhere?
I think again it goes back to infinity. It's perfectly reasonable to assume there's been an infinite number of universes since the beginning of time, which was so far back you can't count it. Yeah. I worry about some of these, like for example the multiverse idea, which is used to answer the anthropic principle, about the fundamental values and constants. If you claim, and these are done, they're actually done to satisfy a mathematical problem. Yeah. That is, you feed this in and the calculations work.
And that problem, just to clarify, is that this universe seems to be incredibly fine-tuned to allow life to exist. And it seems that by random chance, that would be highly unlikely. Therefore, the solution is if we assume there are millions of universes, all with slightly different parameters, then surely by chance one of them would have the right ones.
The problem is that all these other purported universes are totally undetectable. And they go outside any form of science. That is, there is no way you can come up with an idea that says, this is how we can test the theory. So it's a speculation. It satisfies certain types of calculations, certain types of equations, if you like. But beyond that, to be able to say there are other universes like ours, which we can know nothing about, which we cannot contact, which we cannot test, which may work differently to this one, strikes me as being just an empty argument as saying, well, yeah, God did it all.
Or I might put it as being as big a leap of faith, maybe, as believing in God.
I mean, I can understand why people are doing it.
But perhaps the problem with it is that when people like Lawrence Krauss and Stephen Hawking and so on use it, they're not talking about it as a step of faith. They're talking about it in the same breath as testable scientific theories. And I think that can be quite confusing for the average person hearing it.
I think that is. I mean, people hear these statements and assume that because you're listening to a physicist, that they are talking about something that's been proven. What they're talking about is theories.
Trust me, I'm a physicist.
That's right, I'm saying these are very smart people. And I don't know about Hawking. I don't know about Krauss, but I'm sure Hawking wasn't driven by the fact that he didn't believe in God. Whether he did or not is actually irrelevant and should be irrelevant to these kinds of discussions of physics. It just happens that two or three of the most prominent physicists working in this area are also people who are campaigners for atheism and get invited to atheist conferences.
But you don't think that perspective colours their view? I mean, there are other physicists who are not so strongly atheistic, who probably may not be as enthusiastic about ideas like these.
I think it does colour them, certainly, and the people that I've met that do it, and I've met two, which is Vic Stenger, who was Professor of Physics at the University of Hawaii, and Lawrence Krauss. Both seem to be bringing into their physics some ideological position, if you like, or some religious or belief system. Now, they try to keep it out, but Krauss hasn't quite done it, but Vic Stenger actually produced a book claiming that it gave evidence that God doesn't exist.
Yeah, I've got it on my shelf.
Yeah.
It
Now,
doesn't make a very convincing argument in my view, of course.
It doesn't. I mean, basically what his argument is that as he could find no evidence for God, therefore God doesn't exist. That's not really the correct argument he should be doing. But he actually came at it from, obviously if you're going to put out a book saying God's been tested, you're making a religious statement.
Yeah.
Krauss is not really saying that in his book as far as I can see. But it's obvious from knowing the person that that's what he's about.
Yeah, no, I think what Krauss is trying to say is this is another gap, the God of the gaps idea, and this is something that we previously had to attribute to God because we didn't have the scientific knowledge, but here we have a scientific explanation. But of course, I don't think the scientific explanation works because the nothing is not really a nothing.
Yeah.
And to follow on from what you were saying before, even if we accept an infinite series or an infinite set of universes, are we still not left with the question of why that series or set should exist? What are the laws, for example, that govern the beginning of universes and the creation of universes? Where do the laws come from? Aren't they still unanswered questions?
I think they are. We can't deny that it's what the 6 numbers that define our universe. These are values which are so precise that if any of them were any slightly different, we wouldn't be here. It takes only a tiny change in the laws about nuclear forces to stop water being formed.
Yeah.
And without water, we don't have life as we know it on Earth. So yes, there is certainly, we can say that those rules are there. We don't know where they came from. But we have to live with it. Okay?
Well, that leads us to ask the question then, is that the kind of question that science can answer? And perhaps are people like Krauss and Hawking engaging in a kind of fanaticism, the idea that every question of importance can be answered by science, whereas I think many other people, myself included, would say no, there are certainly some questions that science is not equipped to answer.
I think there's certainly questions that we're not going to be able to ever answer. I study philosophy at university. I believe that mind-body duality is an insoluble problem.
So just to clarify, that's the idea that the mind seems to be a non-physical thing and the body is a physical thing.
The body is a physical thing.
Yeah.
Now, how does the physical construction of our brain, how does it manage our thoughts, our beliefs and so forth?
And produce this sense of me.
Yes, sense of me, a sense of consciousness.
Yeah.
Now, this has been argued about for a long time. And it was argued about by religious people and non-religious people. I mean, the people who were arguing this, and obviously the most famous person is René Descartes, these people were religious people.
Certainly.
But they were trying to answer a specific question.
Yeah.
What is it about me that is different what is different when I die?
And his answer actually was part of his attempt to prove the existence of God.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. But it was... So I think those questions can't be answered. They may be one day. I don't believe, for example, that, as I think Daniel Dennett does, that we will understand consciousness as a form of reductionism, that we will finally get to the point we will understand how these chemical and electrical reactions are happening that cause a human being to emerge from it. But then I was around in the early days of artificial intelligence when wonderful things were going to happen if we made more and more complex computers.
Yeah.
Now, the mainframe computers at the time had less power than I've got on my phone now. We still can't do this stuff. We still can't do instantaneous translation of language and make it work all the time.
That suggests that there are things in reality that are not just physical. I wonder, what's your perspective on that?
These are things which I don't know and don't understand.
But do you believe that they are real, I suppose?
Oh, I believe they're real, I study psychology and philosophy.
Yeah.
And they're all about knowing things, how we know things, what questions we should ask. We don't really know how the mind works. We don't know how a whole lot of things work. And I think that there really are problems out there we're never going to know. I don't think we're ever really going to know exactly what triggered the creation of our universe. We can come up with theories about it, but they're always going to be untestable theories. That doesn't really matter about them being untestable, providing they can be justified in some other way. It seems to me that the justification at the moment
Yeah.
is a little bit of the old physics of the gaps. It's, you know,
Well, let's come then to let's call it the hypothesis of God. So, in traditional Orthodox Christianity, we have this approach, technically called an apophatic approach, which is basically that because God transcends reality, because God is so much bigger and beyond anything we can imagine, similar to what you were saying about infinity and nothing and so on. He's something that we cannot imagine, therefore we can't actually pin God down and say this is what God is. But we kind of have to accept the mystery of God. Why is that a bad hypothesis in explaining why there is something rather than nothing?
I don't think it is a bad hypothesis. I think it's just as testable as multiverse. But one of the things that has been happening, and this is from the European Enlightenment onwards, as we've discovered more and more and more things, basically with science, that there have been fewer and fewer places where we can point to it and say God did that.
Sure.
I think the ultimate one is this origin of the universe, origin of everything. And so I don't know whether we can answer that one. There are attempts to do it. I just don't think that the physics should be based on let's try and disprove the existence of God.
Yeah.
They should be based on let's try and find an explanation that matches all the things we know and all the things we can test and all the things we can calculate about the universe as it exists. So I object to the idea that people should go on this search, on this scientific search, based on a religious position.
Yeah.
And some of them certainly seem to be doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, and some of those very same people, and I'm going to put this to you as someone who studied philosophy, Stephen Hawking came out in public recently saying he thought philosophy was dead. There's no room for philosophy because science is going to answer all our questions.
Yeah, I'm actually been attending a series of talks about this. In fact, I'm going to one later this afternoon about the relationship between philosophy and science. Philosophy asks the questions, as theology does. They're there to ask questions. Maybe someone else is going to answer them. So philosophy asks the questions that science answers. These things go together. The idea of saying that if you say that philosophy is dead, basically that's saying there are no more questions to ask. And philosophy doesn't just deal with the scientific things. Philosophy is legitimately concerned with looking from a position of morals, the things we've discussed. Why are there rules? Why do people behave the way they do? And certainly philosophy is there to be able to ask those questions about where did we come from? Where did we
And is it not true that we wouldn't have science if not for philosophy, because philosophy is what lays the foundation for science itself?
Well, Newton was a professor of public philosophy or something it was called. Before the word science was invented, it was called philosophy.
Oh, natural philosophy.
But philosophy is a method of deriving the questions that we need to ask. Those questions, scientists can go and answer those questions. I think some of them may not have any answer. Now, I think that needs to be recognised. That doesn't mean people shouldn't look for the answers. But I think it's a bit premature to actually come out and say, well, we think we've found the answer to that, and that's the answer to everything. No. Because if philosophy is dead, then science is dead, really. But it's not that I'm going to argue too much with Stephen Hawking, but I think that's sort of one of those throwaway lines that people pick up. It was the looking at the eye of God type thing I think he put in one of his books. People all leapt on and said, the man's admitting to the existence of God. And he wasn't. It was just one of those lines you put in a book. So maybe in this one here he was just throwing away a line or no.
Oh, look, that's a very kind interpretation of what he said.
I say again, I think that he's obviously a very clever person, but maybe again he's straight outside his area of expertise.
Yeah, and I think that's often the case with people like that, and we've spoken before of Richard Dawkins and other people like that, who I think, being very good at the science that they do, then think that they must be good at other types of searching for truth and knowledge. And unfortunately, they may not be. But I'd like to come back to something you said a little bit earlier, which is that there may be some questions that we can never answer. Now, I just want to ask you, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that there actually is no answer, there is no reality there to be found? Or do you just mean that we will never have the ability to find the answer. It's something that's beyond us.
I think maybe we just will never have the ability to find it.
Yeah.
There's obviously an answer there somewhere,
Yeah.
but it may be beyond anything we can ever come up with to
Okay.
actually find out what that answer is.
So you're not questioning that the universe is logical and rational. You're just saying that it may be at a level beyond what a human brain can achieve.
I think so, yes. Certainly, I mean, it's logical and predictable. If it wasn't, we'd be having trouble doing things.
Yeah.
There are a whole lot of things we can predict, or we can safely assume will happen or not happen,
Yeah.
based on there are a set of laws of the way the universe works.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the argument about miracles, which we'll talk about in another time.
Yeah.
But I see the universe as a logical place.
That makes sense and so on.
With rules, but I think that there are questions about the universe that maybe we may never be able to answer.
Well, can I be so bold as to say that this is something that's going to bring us a bit closer in our views? Because what you're saying sounds to me not that different to what I was saying earlier about the orthodox approach to the understanding of God, that there is this sense of mystery, that there are things that we may never understand about him. Are we coming a bit closer in our point of view, or do you still think we're very different?
I mean, there are some questions which don't worry me whether they're answered or not. Now, I can find beauty in sunset without having to have someone explain to me in minute detail what a sunset's about and what it looks like.
Sure.
I can walk out in the dark at night time up where I live and see about 10 billion more stars than you can see from this part of Sydney, just because I happen to live somewhere where there's not a lot of street lights. I don't necessarily have to have someone come along and explain to me how some of them are further away than others and so forth. I can find a sense of awe in looking at that sort of stuff. So where those things have to be, I don't have to have explained to me that sense of awe, if you like.
Yeah.
I know it's there. I don't care why. People can come up with all sorts of psychological explanations, but the fact is, it's there. I enjoy it. It makes me feel good. But I'm quite happy to have unanswered questions.
Yeah, which is, may I say, not that common among people I've spoken to generally over the years who are brought up in the scientific sort of philosophy or the scientific worldview. I think since the Enlightenment there's been this attitude that there shouldn't be any question that's beyond our understanding. And I think that may be kind of what motivates people like Krauss and Hawking.
I think there's still legitimate questions to ask.
Yeah.
I just don't think we're ever going to find the answer, which is a different thing to saying that they're not answerable questions.
Sure.
I think that maybe we just say, we've looked at these things for so long, and we've looked at them in all different directions, and maybe there isn't a way we can actually tunnel in and find what the correct answer is. And so we might have to leave that one aside. Now that doesn't mean that we can actually go back to a God of the gaps. It's reasonable to say, well, there is some explanation out there. But at the moment, and within the foreseeable future, and what we know about humanity and human intellect, we may never be able to solve that problem.
The God of the gaps is one of the arguments I think used even in questions like this, where it's kind of saying, although we can't come up with an answer now, but we've had all these other questions that we couldn't answer before and eventually answered, therefore we have confidence that we will answer this one. But I wonder if this question is actually not different to those other questions that were answered. So, for example, where does lightning come from? Well, the ancient pagans thought that the gods were up on Mount Olympus casting their spears, and that was what the lightning was. Is this not a very different kind of question, though? It's kind of a question that goes to the very heart of existence.
I think it is a different type of question. There are some things where you can get a right or wrong answer straight away. Say the lightning thing, we know what causes lightning. It isn't someone throwing thunderbolts from the top of a mountain.
Yeah, and even back then, if you'd sort of stopped to really think about it, you probably could have worked that out.
Yes.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, those sorts of ideas, when the answer was found, nobody cared.
Yeah, well...
because I don't think there wasn't a sort of religious aspect to it. I suppose there was in one sense. Yeah. But it wasn't something which mattered so much that, if that idea was overthrown, the world still kept going the same way it had before. So, but I think fundamental questions like origin of everything are a different class of question. They're a different category.
So might I ask you, Peter, if your answer to this question, if you one day came to an answer to this question, how much would that affect your life?
I'd obviously have to do follow the evidence. You know?
Yeah.
As Bertrand Russell said, what he'd say if God existed,
Yes.
he ended up in heaven. No, why didn't you believe me? Well, there's not enough evidence.
Yeah.
I think
The question I'm asking
Yeah.
really is this a really fundamental question that would change people, the way people live their lives and that sort of thing?
I don't know whether it would be. I think that it might make some people more comfortable in their belief. It might make some people less comfortable in what they were believing. But in terms of how it affects the way people live, no, it makes no difference at all. It's a bit like space exploration. I think it's absolutely incredible that after umpteen years, the first man-made thing has finally left the solar system. It's this tiny little box of electronics of a sort we can't even imagine. In fact, we would laugh now if it was put in front of us as being anything electronic.
Yeah.
What they're finding in the Voyager thing actually makes no difference, if you want to look at it in pure pragmatic terms.
Possibly, pragmatically, that's probably the case. It's not going to change what we're eating or the jobs we're doing.
It's nice to know things.
But perhaps the difference it makes is to the quality of our life, to the view of the universe that we live in, to what the meaning of our life is, perhaps.
Well, I don't think that anything we find out, anything we know, any new knowledge we achieve, is a good thing. It's very rare that we find something new where we can say, gee, I wish we hadn't known that before. Because a lot of that is, that's progress. That's how we get better at things.
Yeah.
If they find a cure for a particular kind of cancer, they're not going to say, well, gee, that was a bad thing because that put doctors out of work. Well, you don't have people making boot hooks anymore since they stopped riding horses all over the place too.
Yeah.
So I don't think a lot of these things might not have any effect, but they make us feel more confident. And I just think the more we know that's correct, the better off we are.
Well, I hope our chat today has helped our viewers to know a little bit more. That's correct.
I think it's made me think a bit more.
and me too, to be honest, as our chats always do. Thank you once again, Peter, for your presence with us today.
Thank you.
And for your insightful thoughts and sharing those comments. And thank you to our viewers for joining us once again today. We hope you've enjoyed this version of Chats with Atheists, and we look forward to seeing you the next time. See you then.